An old woman went into the forest to pick mushrooms, but the ground suddenly opened up beneath her feet. What she found underground shocked everyone. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching us from. Grace Thomas awoke before the sun had begun to touch the horizon. The sky outside her small cabin in the Appalachian foothills was a thick, unbroken gray, and the only movement was the slow breath of the wind passing through pine needles like a patient exhale. She lay on her narrow cot, her eyes fixed on the wood-paneled ceiling that bore years of smoke stains and spider webs. The old beams groaned in the cold, and in the quiet spaces between the creaks, the scurry of mice behind the fireplace made themselves known. No longer strangers, but old tenants she'd grown accustomed to. For 30 years, this cabin had been her sanctuary. Built by her father during his final years, it stood with a kind of silent endurance, resisting rot and memory alike. The wood stove in the corner still coughed a little smoke with each lighting, and the floor under her bare feet always seemed just a little damp, no matter the season. A kettle with a chipped spout sat permanently on the stove, wrapped at the handle with electrician's tape, still holding together after a dozen near burns. Her routine had calcified into ritual. Tea first, then a walk through the eastern grove if the fog wasn't too thick. Grace moved through the kitchen without turning on the lights. A dim transistor radio sputtered static and the faint murmur of a weatherman's voice. There would be mist again today, it said, dense and low, like a cotton sheet thrown over the valley. Grace listened, not for the forecast, but for the spaces between the words. There was a comfort in static that people had forgotten. Her breakfast was modest, half a heel of bread with salt, no butter. The sugar had run out a week ago, and the thought of making the long walk to the general store in Ash Creek stirred no urgency in her. Hunger had never dictated her schedule. Her pantry was lined with dry herbs, mushrooms in mesh sacks, and jars of tinctures she had made by hand. The forest gave, if one listened close enough. She didn't need much. Not anymore. Not since Darren, her only son, had moved away and stopped calling. He sent one postcard last year, a photo of Lake Michigan and a few scrawled lines about a new job and things being okay. She kept it behind a jam jar on the windowsill. Her husband, Luther, had died more than a decade ago, buried in a cemetery that hadn't seen fresh flowers since. It had all started fading after that. Her life became the stillness of wood smoke, the whisper of pine needles, and the hush of fog on dry grass. By 8, she was out the door. The chill nipped through her sleeves, but she welcomed it. Her shoulders, though arthritic, carried the canvas sack and short-handled axe with the steadiness of habit. The axe was more for balance now, or maybe for show. Few threats still lived in these woods, and those that did knew better than to cross her path. She had once led trail crews, taught campers survival skills, and charted paths for park rangers. The locals still called her Ranger Grace, though no one had paid her a salary in over 20 years. She took the path behind the cabin, a narrow trail that curved through old maple and sycamore. Deer prints laced the mud, and small tufts of fur clung to bramble thorns. The morning was quiet, eerily so. No birds sang, even the wind had slowed, only her boots whispered against damp leaves. Somewhere past the broken fence line where the ground dipped toward the ravine, she paused. Something felt off. A patch of moss looked disturbed, as if someone had knelt there, or laid down and left in a hurry. She crouched, pressed her palm to it. The ground was warmer than it should have been. She sniffed the air. A sourness, faint but wrong, clung to the breeze. She stood slowly, narrowing her eyes at the undergrowth ahead. The trees here leaned in toward each other, trunks like conspirators. This part of the forest had always felt heavier, even back when she patrolled it regularly. It was here, she remembered, that the Boyer's hound had gone missing. That was nearly 15 years ago. Then 3 hikers a few years later vanished without a trace. Talk of cougars, of illegal traps, of spirits in the woods, depending on who you asked. But the search always ended when the fog grew too thick or the ground too wet, and over time, people forgot. Grace did not forget. Her memory, like the land, held on to its dead with a stubbornness that frightened her sometimes. She moved ahead, climbing over a fallen birch. Her fingers tingled with cold. The air here smelled of iron. Then it happened. She stepped forward onto a patch of moss no different from the others. There was no warning. The earth gave way beneath her like a breath held too long. She tried to scream, but it caught in her throat as she dropped. The fall was brief but violent. Her side slammed against something hard and unyielding, and then she landed on her back, her limbs screaming in protest. Darkness swallowed her whole. Above, the moss settled again, as if undisturbed. A crow circled once, cawed, then vanished into the thickening mist. Later that day, her dog, an old hound named Buck, howled at her doorstep. When her mail remained untouched and the lights never flicked on, a neighbor named Pete mentioned it to the cashier at the diner. They shrugged. Grace probably wandered off for a while, like she sometimes did. Maybe she went to visit her cousin in Knoxville. But the mail kept piling up, and Buck never stopped howling. Back underground, Grace drifted in and out of consciousness. The cold seeped through her bones. She was aware of something. Stone, damp air, and an unnatural silence so thick it pressed against her ears. There was no wind down here, no birds, only her own breath, shallow and trembling, echoing faintly off the walls of a place she did not yet understand. And the sense, deep in her chest, that she was not alone. The sound of gravel under tires broke the sleepy rhythm of Ash Creek as Daryl Cooper pulled his truck into the narrow driveway of the ranger station. The sun hadn't yet pierced the thick fog that blanketed the forest, and the radio in his cab whispered the early morning forecast with all the enthusiasm of someone forced to read it. He reached for his thermos, took a sip of bitter coffee, and stared through the windshield at the squat building ahead, its porch sagging slightly and paint peeling off the wood siding. It looked like a place time forgot, much like the rest of this forgotten corner of the Appalachian foothills. Daryl had arrived in Ash Creek only 4 months ago, fresh from a short stint in the Georgia Forestry Division, and before that, 3 years in the National Guard. He was still young by local standards, barely 30, with a wiry frame and sharp eyes that missed little. His transfer here had been half voluntary, half escape. The kind of place no one wanted to work unless they had something to leave behind or something they were running from. For Daryl, it was both. He parked, killed the engine, and stepped out into the chill. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and rain-soaked leaves. At the door, he nodded to the deputy inside, a round man named Randy who never seemed to rise from his chair unless the coffee pot ran dry. They exchanged curt greetings, neither offering small talk. It was Pete Wilkerson who first brought it up, stopping Daryl near the general store that afternoon. Pete was in his 60s, a longtime local who wore flannel like a second skin and chewed on the same toothpick every day. He leaned against the rusted tailgate of his pickup and gestured toward the hills. "You been up toward Grace Thomas's place lately?" Daryl shook his head. "Not in a week or so. Something wrong?" Pete frowned, his leathery face pulling tight. "Ain't seen her. Dog's been barking outside her place since Monday. Mail's piling up. She don't miss market day without reason." Daryl raised an eyebrow. "You think she's sick?" "I think she's gone," Pete said quietly. Daryl didn't dismiss it. Something in the man's tone rooted itself in his gut. Grace Thomas wasn't just another reclusive elder in the valley. She had a reputation, a woman who once served as a ranger long before most of the current force had their first badge. Locals respected her, even if they didn't understand her. And if she was missing, it meant something. That afternoon, he drove the winding dirt road toward her cabin. The trees leaned closer here, and the forest swallowed most of the sunlight even on clear days. The air was thick with dampness, the mist hanging low like breath caught in the throats of the hills. When he arrived, the yard was eerily quiet. Buck, her hound, was nowhere in sight. The porch creaked under his boots, and the screen door gave way with a reluctant groan. Inside, the house was neat. Unnaturally neat. A cup sat on the table, still with the faint ring of tea long gone cold. A slice of bread had dried into a curl beside it. The radio whispered softly in the background, as if talking to no one at all. No sign of struggle, no sign of panic, just the feeling that someone had stepped out for a moment and never returned. He called her name, once, twice. No answer. He moved to the back room where her cot stood undisturbed. A thick notebook lay on the small table beside it, opened to the most recent page. He hesitated, then read. "Soft footsteps last night near the fence line. No animal. Too heavy. Wind stopped before they came. Started again after they passed." The next line was underlined twice. "I think something's listening." Daryl stared at the page. He flipped back through previous entries. Many were innocuous. Notes on weather patterns, local bird migrations, and mushroom growth. But scattered between them were odd observations. Missing pets, strange smells, flickering lights through the trees. A pattern began to form, subtle but persistent. He closed the notebook and stepped outside. Over the next 2 days, Daryl initiated a quiet search. Nothing official, no press, no formal missing persons, just a few volunteers from town, old-timers who remembered Grace and owed her something. They spread out into the hills, walking old trails and deer paths, scanning the thick underbrush. But the forest offered nothing in return. It kept its secrets. At the edge of a steep ravine behind Grace's property, they found her basket. Wicker, worn, with a cracked handle. Inside were mushrooms, brown caps she'd likely picked that morning. Next to it, a torn piece of cloth snagged on a jagged branch. Daryl held it in his hands. It smelled faintly of cedar and something else, something musty and unfamiliar, the kind of smell that lived underground. The ground beneath his boots was soft, wet from recent rains. Moss grew thick here, too thick. He stepped carefully, testing the soil. There was no sign of a fall, no pit, no broken earth. But something about the way the trees clustered here, the way the birds stayed away, it unsettled him. Back at the station, Daryl filed a basic report, more to satisfy protocol than in the hope it would prompt action. He left out the stranger details. He knew how they sounded. That night, as he sat in his truck outside the ranger station, thumbing through Grace's notebook again, he noticed something tucked into the last page. A folded scrap of paper, jagged along one edge as if torn hastily. Written in thick, uneven letters, "She's listening now. The soil speaks." No signature, no context. The next morning, Daryl returned to the ravine. He stood at the same spot where they'd found the basket. He circled the area, searching for any shift in the landscape. A pile of stones, a twisted root, a breath of cold air where there shouldn't be one. He felt it before he saw it, a prickle on the back of his neck, That sense of being watched, not by an animal, not by a person, but by the woods themselves. It was the same feeling he'd had overseas, lying in desert brush, waiting for movement in the stillness. The knowledge that you were no longer alone, even if your eyes said otherwise. He turned slowly. At the top of the ridge stood a man, still as stone, half obscured by a thick pine, dressed in a dark coat, hat pulled low, watching. Daryl raised a hand. The figure did not move. He took one step forward. The man was gone. Later that evening, Daryl went over the old incident logs in the station's archive. Few of them were digital. Most were faded manila folders stored in rusted file cabinets that hadn't been opened in years. He found one from 1996. 3 local boys, campers, had gone missing during a summer storm, searched for 3 days, never found. The file ended with a familiar phrase, presumed runaway. Another file from 2003. A mother and son vanished on a trail hike. Her car still parked at the lot. Case closed for lack of leads. The same location appeared in both reports. The ravine, the same forested slope behind Grace's land. He sat back, the pages fanned out before him. He ran a hand through his hair and muttered under his breath. Something was wrong in Ash Creek. Something old. By the end of the week, news of Grace's disappearance began to spread through the town. Posters went up at the diner, the gas station, and the church bulletin board. A few high schoolers offered to help with the next round of search. Buck, her dog, was taken in by Pete for the time being. But no one, not even the sheriff, seemed to treat it like a priority. "People wander off all the time," the sheriff said. "Maybe she didn't want to be found." Daryl didn't argue. But that night, someone left another note on his windshield. It was written in the same thick black strokes as before. This one said only, "You're getting closer." He kept the note, locked it in his glove box. He didn't sleep that night. The forest outside his cabin pressed against the windows like a living thing. The wind was absent, and the usual night sounds were gone. Even the insects held their breath. The next morning, he returned to Grace's cabin. The door was still unlocked. Inside, the air was stale but untouched. He walked to the back room, opened the drawer of her nightstand, and found a small flashlight. It flickered once, then steadied. He turned it off, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and stepped back outside. He didn't know why he took it, only that something told him he might need it soon. As he closed the door behind him, a crow screamed from the trees above. In the ravine, far from the light of the world above, Grace opened her eyes in darkness. The stone beneath her was cold. Somewhere nearby something moved, slow, methodical, and breathing. She stayed still, barely daring to inhale. She was not alone. There was no telling how long she had been unconscious. Time in that place didn't move in hours or minutes. It moved in temperature, in pressure, in silence. Grace's body came back to her in fragments. The numb ache in her right arm, the stiff throb in her ribs, the dryness in her throat. The air she breathed was wet and cold, full of minerals and mildew, and each inhale felt like a sponge being pressed to the back of her throat. Her first thought, hazy and instinctual, was simple. I'm underground. She didn't try to sit up at first. She listened, carefully, slowly, as she had been trained decades ago when she first joined the Forest Service. Back then, they called it reading the stillness. It meant learning the difference between true silence and the quiet that follows danger. What she heard now was the latter, an oppressive hush, the kind that wraps itself around a place like a warning. When she finally opened her eyes, there was nothing but blackness. not the kind you get at night under the stars. This was complete, suffocating, physical darkness. She reached into her coat pocket with shaking fingers and found her small headlamp. She clicked it on. The beam flickered, then steadied, casting a trembling halo against a ceiling of red brick and rotting mortar. Above her, the brickwork arched slightly, indicating a tunnel or chamber rather than a vertical shaft. One of the stones was cracked and leaking a slow trickle of water. The floor beneath her was dirt, packed and damp, bordered by slabs of concrete. On the left, a rusted metal door frame hung with no door. Beyond it stretched a passage shrouded in shadow. She sat up slowly, wincing. Her left side radiated pain. Bruised, maybe cracked ribs. Her wrist ached when she flexed it. She checked her legs, her arms. Nothing felt broken. She was lucky. Or maybe unlucky, depending on what this place turned out to be. The air was too still. No wind, no hum of electricity, no distant sounds of machinery or life. Just the soft drip of water and the faint sound of her own breathing, which grew louder the longer she listened. She forced herself to her feet. Every movement sent sharp complaints through her side, but she gritted her teeth and bore it. The instinct to move, to understand, was stronger than the pain. She held the headlamp steady and took her first steps into the corridor. The beam revealed walls covered in flaking paint and patches of black mold. Some areas showed exposed brick, others were coated in cracked plaster. Here and there, she saw old signage stenciled on the walls in faded letters. Level B, Storage 3, Restricted. The labels were government standard, the kind she hadn't seen since the early 80s, when she'd once been granted access to a decommissioned firewatch station built into a mountainside. This place felt older, though, abandoned but not entirely forgotten. She turned a corner and found what looked like a small rest station. A wooden bench sat against the wall, half collapsed under its own weight. A rusted locker stood ajar, its contents long since removed. On the wall above the bench, a chain hung from a bolt. At its end was a metal ring, bolted to the wall. Below it, a discoloration in the concrete, a patch darker than the rest. She leaned closer. It was a stain. Old, but unmistakable. Blood. Grace straightened, her chest tightening. She had seen many things in her time in the wilderness. Maulings, accidents, even a man who'd lost his leg to a bear trap. But this had the shape of ritual. The chain, the placement, the silence. She didn't want to stay, but something caught her eye. A scrap of cloth stuck beneath the edge of the bench. She knelt, reached for it. It was stiff, waterlogged, but as she turned it in her fingers, she saw letters embroidered near the hem in faded thread. MV. Her heart stuttered. Maria Vasquez. The missing woman. The one her neighbor had asked about, the one who had vanished in these same woods. Grace stood frozen, the fabric clenched in her hand. The cloth was old, but not ancient. The embroidery thread hadn't rotted completely. That meant someone had been here within the past year. Maybe within the past month. And if Maria had been brought here... Grace didn't finish the thought. Instead, she turned and walked deeper into the tunnel. Her headlamp was growing dim, but she pressed on, tracing the passage with one hand along the wall to steady herself. Every few feet, she passed another side corridor, some blocked with fallen debris, others stretching into pure blackness. She marked her path in her mind, left at the split with the rusted pipes, right past the leaning locker, straight through the arch with the missing bricks. Eventually, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. The floor here was different. smoothed concrete with drainage grates set in a grid. A desk stood in the center, flanked by filing cabinets and stacks of papers strewn across the surface. A map was pinned to the wall, yellowed and torn, marked with small red pins and lines in black ink. Some of the lines traced known trails and fire roads. Others cut through unmarked areas. The red pins formed a ring around the ravine behind her cabin. She stepped closer. Her eyes moved across the map, searching. There, right near the center, a red circle drawn by hand, and next to it, Grace T. A chill passed through her. Her name, in this place. She looked down at the desk. More papers, most covered in numbers, notations, observations. 0912, observed movement near Trail 7. 1001, subject collected mushrooms near Sector 2B. 1006, subject remained alone 97% of time. It read like a wildlife study, only the subject was her. Watched, cataloged, tracked. Among the papers was a single photograph, black and white. It showed her standing on her porch, drinking tea. The angle was high, distant, taken from the woods, maybe from a game camera. She felt sick, but then the light caught something behind the desk. She moved closer. A corkboard. On it, dozens of pinned photographs. Faces, some blurry, some clear, young, old, all of them alone, all of them candid shots. At the center, with a red string connecting them in a chaotic web, was a photo of a young boy, maybe 11, maybe 12. His eyes were wide, lips pressed in a thin line. No name, just the date. 3 days ago. Below that, another image. A teenager, pale, with long hair covering half his face. His eyes seemed too empty, too focused. Beneath his image, in sharp handwriting, Andrew, active, receptive, knows the way. The knot in her stomach grew. There were too many faces, too many dates. Some went back over a decade, others only a few weeks. She saw Maria's photo, her neighbor's friend, tacked to the edge. Beneath it, the word resisted. And then, near the bottom right corner, a final photo. It was her again. This time, not on her porch, but in the woods. Carrying her basket, head turned slightly. The image was blurry, taken through foliage. Beneath it, has begun listening. Her knees nearly buckled. She backed away, her breath caught in her throat. Something about this place was wrong on a level deeper than physical. It was psychological, emotional. The sense that someone had been watching not just her movements, but her mind, her thoughts. Suddenly, a sound, a slow scrape, metal on stone. Her head whipped around. The sound echoed from the hallway behind her. Footsteps, measured, heavy. She turned off her headlamp. The darkness returned in full, swallowing everything. She pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear. The steps grew closer, then stopped. Silence, then breathing. She could hear it. Low, controlled, and near. She didn't move, didn't blink. Every part of her screamed to run, but her body stayed frozen. The sound faded. The footsteps retreated. 1, then 2, then 3. Gone. She waited 5 more minutes before she moved. When she turned her headlamp back on, the beam sputtered, nearly dead. She stumbled back toward the passage, retracing her steps. She passed the bench with the chain, the cracked brick, the rusted pipes. The lamp died completely 10 feet from where she remembered the opening to be. She reached with her hands, searching. Moss, dirt, crumbling stone, then cold air on her fingers. She found the sloping wall, began to climb. Her legs trembled with each push, her fingers slipping on the wet stone. Twice she slid back, biting her lip to stop from crying out. Something tugged at her boot, roots maybe. She kicked loose. When she reached the surface, the forest night met her like a slap. The stars were veiled behind a heavy mist. The air was thick with the smell of rain and moss. She collapsed on the grass, heaving. Every breath was sharp, but it was real. Clean. Alive. She lay there a long time. When she finally stood, she turned back toward the opening. It was gone. No door. No hole. Just moss, as if the earth had swallowed its own wound. She reached into her coat, pulled out the embroidered cloth, folded it, and placed it in a sealed plastic bag from her pocket. Then she turned and walked. Not home, to town, to someone who would listen. Because she knew now, this place wasn't abandoned. It wasn't forgotten. It was active. And she was not the first. The forest had grown colder in the last few days. The kind of chill that clung not only to the skin, but settled behind the ribs like something deliberate. Daryl Cooper felt it as he sat alone in his kitchen, the radio murmuring low jazz in the background, his eyes fixed on the paper-strewn table before him. Grace's cloth, sealed in a plastic evidence bag, lay to the right. To the left, his hastily drawn map of the ravine and the nearby ridge where she'd most likely vanished. She had returned from the woods the night before, trembling and bruised, a small cut across her cheek, her hair matted with sweat and mud. But her eyes, they hadn't blinked much. They were wide and hollow, as if whatever she'd seen had moved behind them and made a nest. She didn't say much that night, only that she had been underground, that there were rooms and chains, photographs and charts. Someone had been studying her, and others. She gave him the cloth, explained who Maria was, and told him she believed there were more people down there, or had been. Daryl had wanted to call for backup right then, but Grace had stopped him with a single look, not of fear, but of quiet resolve. "Not yet," she had said. "Not until you see it for yourself." Now, with the sun crawling through the blinds and dew clinging to his boots, Daryl returned to that ridge. The same path they had searched days ago, where they had found the basket and the torn cloth. Nothing about the landscape had changed, and that, in itself, was alarming. Because according to Grace, there had been an opening here, a breach in the earth. And now there was nothing but moss and stone, as smooth and unbroken as if time itself had ironed it flat. He crouched low, ran his hand along the surface of the ground. It felt compact, too compact. Moss grew evenly across it, but not like anywhere else. Here it formed a perfect patch. No bare spots, no twigs or leaves fallen into the natural creases of earth. It looked placed, manufactured. His fingers pushed into the moss gently. Damp, spongy. He pressed harder. Nothing. He circled the area. From the top of the hill, he could see the forest unfold in all directions. It was beautiful from up here, vast, ancient, unknowable. But now it felt like a blanket hiding something broken beneath it. He pulled out his phone and took several photos. Not because he expected them to capture anything unusual, but because he felt the need to document this moment, to keep proof of his suspicion. Proof that wouldn't vanish as easily as a hole in the ground. He didn't go home that night. He went to the records office in town, a single-story building with flickering lights and a clerk who always smelled faintly of menthol. Daryl requested access to old land use maps, especially anything tied to government facilities, fire watch posts, or Cold War-era installations. The clerk raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. Daryl had a badge, even if it wasn't the kind that usually earned much deference in places like this. 3 hours later, he sat cross-legged on the office floor, files spread around him like fallen leaves. Most of them were unremarkable. Plots for farmland, documentation for zoning changes, expired permits. But then he found it. Project Deep Glen. A permit dated 1959. issued jointly by the Department of Agriculture and the Army Corps of Engineers. Purpose: Environmental Monitoring Station. Location: South Ridge Sector B, Plot 219. There was no mention of construction completion, no closure date, no final report. He requested to copy the file. The clerk shrugged, ran it through the machine, and handed him the thin sheaf of papers. By the time he left, the sun had dipped behind the hills, and the world had taken on that pale indigo hue that comes just before true night. He drove with his high beams on, hands tight around the wheel. He didn't return to the ridge. He went to see Lee. The old man's trailer stood half hidden behind a curtain of pines just off the south trail. Daryl had passed it a dozen times, but had never seen anyone come or go. Lee was one of those locals people talked about in the way you talk about a stain on the sidewalk, something unpleasant but not dangerous. He bought supplies in bulk once a month, didn't make eye contact, didn't attend church. That was enough to keep most people from asking questions, but Daryl had seen him. The first time was the night after Grace disappeared. A figure standing on the edge of the ridge watching. He hadn't recognized the face then, but now he was sure. He parked at the edge of the clearing, stepped out into the cooling air and approached the door. No lights inside. Smoke rose from the stovepipe. He knocked once, firmly. Nothing. He knocked again. A long moment passed, and then the door creaked open an inch. A single eye peered out, pale, watery, rimmed red. "Ranger," the old man said. "Evening, Lee. What brings you?" "I think you know." The door didn't open further, but Lee didn't close it either. "You've been watching the ridge," Daryl continued. "You were there the night Grace went missing." Lee said nothing. "There's something under that hill," Daryl pressed. "Something you've seen. Maybe something you were part of." A long pause. Then Lee spoke, voice low and hoarse. "They built it during the war. Said it was a listening station. Radiation, air quality, seismic noise. Only I don't think that's what they were listening to." "What then?" Lee finally opened the door. The trailer was sparse, claustrophobic. One bed, a rusted stove, stacks of newspapers yellowing in the corners. On one wall hung an old map, military by the looks of it, covered in thumbtacks and notes written in pencil. Daryl stepped inside, eyes sweeping the room. "They told us to stop digging after 60 meters," Lee said, settling into a worn armchair. "But the crew kept hearing things, echoes, not from above, from below. Below? Voices, breathing. We thought it was just cave gas, echoes of our own work. But then people started getting sick, not physically. Up here," he tapped his temple. "One by one they left. Some disappeared. No reports, no inquiries. The forest took them." Daryl turned to the map. The thumbtacks formed a pattern. Clusters near trails, old ranger stations, fire watch towers long since dismantled. At the center of it all was the ridge. "They called it Deep Glen," Lee muttered. "But no one remembers now. They burned the records, filled the tunnels with cement. They didn't do a good job." Lee laughed bitterly. "No, they never do." That night, Daryl couldn't sleep. The forest outside his cabin was too quiet. No crickets, no owls, just the wind brushing the tops of the trees like a warning. He lay awake until dawn, then gathered his gear. Rope, flashlight, spare batteries, his service weapon. He left a note on his desk. "If I don't return by nightfall, check the ridge." The hike back was tense. The trail seemed different. Quieter, yes, but also narrower somehow. Trees leaning in, roots more exposed, as if the land were shifting, bracing. At the top of the ridge, he paused. The moss patch. It was open. A narrow crack, just wide enough for a man to slip through. No sound came from within. No light. He tied the rope around a nearby tree, anchored it, and began his descent. The tunnel was steep, damp, and claustrophobic. The smell hit him immediately: old earth, mildew, and something metallic underneath. He moved slowly, flashlight cutting narrow beams through the dark. The walls were concrete, cracked in places, with thick cables running along the ceiling like veins. He reached a landing. The corridor split in two. Left, toward the collapsed area Grace described. Right, toward the station. He went right. Each step echoed, footfalls like whispers. He passed rooms, storage areas with rusted tools, empty bunks with moldy mattresses, filing cabinets long since emptied. But then he found it. A room with light. A single fluorescent fixture, buzzing faintly, flickering. Inside, the corkboard, just as Grace had described. He approached slowly. The photos, the faces, names, and dates. Maria, the young boy, and himself, captured from across the street, standing beside his truck. Beneath his photo, potential disruption, escalate if necessary. His throat tightened. He turned, heart racing. Someone had been here recently. Maybe still was. He stepped back into the corridor. A sound. Footsteps. Deliberate. Approaching. He raised his flashlight, aimed it down the hall. The beam caught a figure halfway in shadow. Young, thin, unblinking, and smiling. Daryl froze. Then the figure stepped back into the dark and vanished. He didn't give chase, not yet. He had seen enough. He turned and retraced his steps, climbing fast, adrenaline burning in his veins. When he emerged, the sky was darkening again. Fog clung to the ground. The trees didn't move. He didn't speak. Not yet. He had to plan, because whatever had been built down there wasn't just surviving. It was waiting. The decision was made the next morning, not by some committee or official mandate, not with press conferences or search warrants. It was made quietly between a forest ranger with haunted eyes and a woman who'd seen too much to ever go back to silence. Daryl didn't need convincing. He had looked into the hole. He had seen the photographs, the maps, the faces, and he had seen the boy. They sat together in Grace's kitchen as the sun broke through the trees and slanted across the cracked countertop, dust motes dancing like insects in a shaft of gold. The dog, Buck, rested beneath the table, old and tired but attentive to every movement. Grace poured tea with a hand that no longer trembled, her strength reclaimed not by recovery but by resolve. She moved slower than she used to, with a stiffness in her side that betrayed the memory of the fall, but her gaze was steady. She spoke plainly. "He watches from the edge of the woods every night," she said, "always the same hour, and then he leaves. Back underground, I think." Daryl nodded. "I saw him too, down there. He wasn't surprised to see me." "He's not hiding anymore," she said. "That's not the kind of fear that makes people vanish. He wants to be seen. That's the part I don't like." They didn't need to say what they were both thinking. It wasn't just about Grace anymore, or Maria, or the others. Something was escalating, becoming bolder. The patterns on the corkboard hadn't been random. They were organized, planned, monitored. They had both seen the latest photo. A boy, no older than 12, and it had been dated just 3 days ago. Daryl contacted the state police that afternoon under the guise of requesting additional mapping equipment and geological assistance. He avoided specifics. He used terms like possible sinkhole activity, unmapped utility structure, hazardous access zone. The real report he filed in person, not with the sheriff, but with an agent from the state investigative unit, someone he'd met during wildfire coordination drills 2 years prior. Agent Morales. A practical man with a sharp jawline and no time for ghost stories. To his credit, Morales listened, asked the right questions, jotted notes in a leather-bound pad. Then he closed it and said, "We'll keep this in confidence, but we need proof." Daryl left the city that evening feeling something worse than frustration, a sense of delay, as if time itself were being squandered while something beneath the earth kept moving forward. He didn't sleep that night. He returned to the hill just before midnight. The air was cool, the sky clear, stars burned overhead like frozen sparks, and the forest held its breath as it always did in those hours before dawn. Daryl stood in the same clearing where the moss had once opened like a mouth and swallowed Grace whole. The ground was sealed again, undisturbed, but not for long. He planted the hidden motion sensor near the base of a pine just out of sight and angled the trail camera to cover the clearing from above. No flash, no click, only infrared, only silence. Then he left. The next day brought a twist. A new missing person report. A boy, age 12, from a neighboring town 30 miles west. Last seen riding his bike after school. His mother had called the school, then the police. Then, in desperation, the ranger station. Grace heard it on the radio. Daryl heard it in the office. Neither said a word for the first minute. Then Daryl stood, got his keys, and drove to her cabin. She met him at the porch before he could knock. "They're moving faster," she said. "They're not waiting anymore." That night, they met Morales again. This time, Morales brought a team. Not a task force, no badges, no news vans, just 4 plainclothes agents with government-issued packs and the kind of restraint that said they'd seen worse, though not much. They set up a mobile command post in the ranger station's back room. Daryl showed them the map, the notes, the corkboard photos. He showed them the spot on the ridge. The operation began 48 hours later. The public knew nothing. The media had moved on. The town was quiet. Daryl was the bait. They dressed it up as routine. A ranger checking trails, a solo patrol. He was mic'd, tracked, shadowed by infrared from 3 positions. One team in the woods with thermals, another on the ridge. The last, Morales himself, stayed with Grace in the command room, watching live feeds. As dusk fell, Daryl walked into the forest. The deeper he went, the quieter it became. Trees swallowed sound and mist began to rise in long, curling threads. He wore the same clothes from the photograph they'd found in the tunnel. He carried the same flashlight. He followed the same trail. Every movement was slow, intentional. He stopped at the same points he had the week before. He let his beam linger on the moss. He looked behind him every few minutes. The camera team reported no movement for the first hour. Then came the signal. A shape at the edge of the frame. A man. No, a boy. Tall, thin, hair long, no visible weapon, no obvious intent. He stepped into view like someone entering a room he owned. Daryl turned. The figure stood across the clearing, just behind a line of saplings, no more than 10 yards away. He did not speak. Neither did Daryl. They looked at each other for what felt like minutes. Then the boy, if he was still a boy, smiled. Not wide, not cruel, just a quiet curl of the mouth, a knowing smile. And he turned, walked, straight toward the ridge. Daryl followed. He didn't need direction. He knew where the boy was going. He knew the ground would open. And it did. Just past the last cedar, beneath the roots of a leaning tree, the moss gave way. A crack appeared, then widened. The boy slipped in without effort. Daryl stepped to the edge, then looked over his shoulder. Morales spoke in his earpiece. "We're in position. Proceed." He climbed down. The tunnel felt colder than before, more humid. The walls were slick, the smell was stronger. He moved fast. The team was 30 seconds behind him. Cameras rolling, weapons ready. No light, only thermal. No talking. He turned right at the first split, past the locker. Reached the door with the corkboard. Empty. The photos were gone. The desk had been cleared, the map removed. The room was swept clean, as if someone had known they were coming. But the boy was waiting. At the far end of the hallway, just past the intersection near the generator room, he stood in the shadows, head tilted. "You're too late," he said softly. Daryl raised his flashlight. "You're Andrew?" "No," the boy said. "Andrew was before me." "Where's the child?" "He's with the forest now." Daryl stepped forward. "What does that mean?" "He's learning, like I did, like the others. You don't hear it, do you? The roots, the blood, the rhythm." From the side tunnels, footsteps echoed, multiple. The team moved fast. "Get down," someone shouted. But the boy didn't run. He smiled again, and he whispered, "I was born here." The next moments blurred. A flash of movement, a scuffle, shouting. The boy lunged, not with rage, but with purpose. Daryl tackled him. They hit the floor hard. The smell of rust and sweat filled the air. Hands grabbed the boy. He didn't fight. He laughed. A soft, distant laugh. Morales cuffed him. Another agent swept the tunnels. They found another chamber, this one smaller. Inside, signs of life, a blanket, a tin plate, a child's shoe, but no child, only the smell of smoke. Back above ground, the team emerged into mist and wind. The forest didn't move. Grace met them at the station. She looked at the boy, now slumped in the back of an unmarked SUV, his face blank. She didn't speak. Neither did he. Later, in the medic's tent, Daryl sat with his shirt torn, a cut above his eyebrow, a bruise forming on his shoulder. The adrenaline wore off slowly. Grace stood beside him. "It wasn't just him," she said. "Someone raised him in that place, fed him lies, made him into this." Daryl nodded. "He's not the first." "No," she said, "and he won't be the last." Outside, the forest rustled again for the first time in days. A single leaf fell, and somewhere, deep underground, something waited. The boy didn't speak for the first 2 days. They held him in a secured medical facility, not a jail cell. He was too young, too fragile-looking, too unresponsive for the standard procedures. No family came forward. No school records matched his fingerprints. No missing persons reports listed a child with his face. He didn't eat much, though the doctors said he wasn't malnourished. He slept in short, tense bursts, waking with eyes wide open, never blinking for long. When he did speak, it wasn't to answer questions. It was to say things that didn't seem connected to the present. Phrases like, "He's listening," or "We are deeper than the bones," or "The earth does not forget." Grace watched the footage on the second night. Morales had arranged for her and Daryl to see the recordings from the helmet cams during the underground raid. She sat stiffly in a folding chair in the back of the ranger station's converted office, arms crossed, eyes never leaving the monitor. The footage showed the moment the moss parted. The descent, the chambers, the boy, the struggle, his words. She didn't shiver when he said her name. "He watched her the longest," the boy had whispered, smiling through the split lips. "She hears the breathing now. It came to her in the roots. It remembers who she was." Daryl leaned forward, pausing the video. "He's not just repeating things. He's talking to something, or through something." Morales stood near the wall, arms folded, expression unreadable. "There's a limit to how much we can put into a report," he said. "The agency will accept physical evidence. The rest, the voices and rituals and forest nonsense, they'll bury that with red ink. Grace stood slowly. He didn't come from nowhere. There were adults involved. This wasn't the work of a boy left in the dark too long. "We're trying to trace it," Morales said, "but whatever program built that place, it's not on any active record. We found scrubbed references, black bar memos, personnel lists with names that lead to dead ends. It's like chasing ghosts." "Maybe that's exactly what we're chasing," Daryl muttered. That night, Grace didn't return to her cabin. She stayed in the ranger station, sleeping in the cot by the back wall, a shotgun leaning against the filing cabinet beside her. She had lived alone in the forest for years, never feared its sounds or its silence, but now there was something different in the night air, a heaviness as though the ground itself was restless. The next morning, the boy escaped. There was no sign of forced entry or a breach in security. The guards swore he'd been sedated. The cameras caught nothing, no movement, no shadow. One moment he was there, lying on the cot, and the next the blanket was empty. The door locked, the lights still on. Daryl was called at dawn. Grace was already standing outside when he arrived, the wind catching her coat, her eyes tired but calm. "He's gone back to the hill," she said simply. "You don't know that." "I do." They didn't wait for authorization. Morales was still tied up in conference calls, trying to explain an impossible disappearance to men who believed in procedure more than footprints. Grace and Daryl packed gear in silence. No words were needed. They both knew this wasn't about one boy anymore. When they reached the ridge, the moss was already parting. The forest was quieter than ever. No birds, no insects, just wind. The trail cameras were dead, their batteries drained though they'd been new. The motion sensors showed nothing. The ground looked untouched except for the way it opened. Grace went first. Her body ached as she lowered herself into the dark, but she didn't hesitate. Daryl followed close behind. They moved with practiced speed, following the same route, deeper than before. The familiar tunnels gave way to new ones, narrower, older, with symbols etched into the walls that neither of them recognized. Not letters, not numbers, spirals, shapes, lines that followed no logic. The air grew colder. They reached a chamber that had not been on any of the earlier maps. The walls were smoother here, the stone older. A circle had been drawn on the floor in what looked like ash. At its center, a small wooden effigy stood, no more than 2 feet tall, shaped crudely like a man. Its face was blank. Its arms were raised. The boy stood behind it. He did not flinch when the flashlight beams hit him. He didn't blink. "You shouldn't have come," he said softly. "You ran," Daryl said. "You made us follow." "No," the boy said. "She did." He looked at Grace. "She woke it up. She stood on the roots, and it opened its eyes again." Grace didn't speak. The boy stepped aside. Behind him, another door, a massive one, half-rotted but clearly once reinforced. Symbols covered it, too. There was no handle. "You can't stop it," he said. "It remembers too much." Daryl raised his weapon, but Grace lowered his hand. "Talk to me," she said to the boy. "Tell me who made this place. Who brought you here?" "They didn't bring me," he said. "They made me, and then they left. But the forest didn't. It kept me, taught me." "Taught you what?" "How to listen, how to wait." "Wait for what?" "For someone to remember." The ground trembled, slightly, but enough to be felt through boots. The symbols on the door began to glow faintly, as if reacting to breath, or thought. Grace stepped forward. "Don't," the boy whispered, but she did. Her fingers brushed the surface of the door, and it opened. The chamber beyond was vast, far larger than any tunnel could have allowed. A hollow cavern of impossible architecture, lined with roots that pulsed gently like veins. In the center, a pool of water. Still, black, perfect. And in its reflection, not themselves, but others. Men in uniforms from another decade, faces half-burned, children in cages, women screaming without sound, ghosts perhaps, or memories, or warnings. Grace turned away. "We seal it," she said, "right now. Collapse the tunnel. We don't have the equipment. We have enough." They laid charges where the foundation seemed weakest. Old support beams, cracking cement. The boy watched silently. He did not resist. As they climbed out, he remained below. "I'll stay," he said. "It's my home." "You'll die down there." "I already did." They didn't argue. They detonated the charges at dusk. The ground groaned, split, then settled. Dust rose in thick columns. The forest held its breath. And then it exhaled. In the weeks that followed, the missing child was found, not in the tunnels, but walking the road outside town, dazed and dehydrated, but alive. He remembered little, only fragments, roots, darkness, a voice that told him stories in a language he didn't understand. The media reported it as a miracle. Grace moved out of the cabin. She didn't go far, just closer to the town's edge. Enough to hear voices, dogs, radios, enough to feel human again. Daryl stayed on as ranger, but he patrolled differently now. He watched the ground as much as the trees, and at night he kept a lantern lit by the window. The forest did not return to normal, not fully. Some sounds never came back. Some trails closed on their own. Some places grew colder than the rest. But the hills stayed quiet, for now, because the roots remember, and they are always listening. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to subscribe for more. Watch the next video or check out others on the channel. And don't forget to share this one with someone who'd love it.